Meeting to order. Welcome to the meeting number 67 of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The committee is meeting today to continue its study on foreign election interference. The clerk and I will maintain a consolidated speaking list of members wishing to speak. We have with us today the Honourable Marco Mendicino, Minister of Public Safety. The Minister is accompanied by David Mignon, Director, Canadian Security Intelligence Services, and Sean Tupper, Deputy Minister, Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. Welcome back to you all. Minister, you will have up to 5 minutes for your comments. Welcome back to PROC. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm here today to discuss the very real threat posed by foreign interference and what our government is actively doing to address this threat to our national security. This committee has already heard from numerous witnesses on our government's dedication to combating foreign interference. Today, I want to reiterate that we have put in place robust measures to safeguard our national security and public safety. As this committee well knows, democracies around the world have been faced with the growing threat posed by hostile actors. This issue is not new, and it's not unique to Canada. The Communications Security Establishment and the Canadian Security Intelligence Service have indeed alerted Canadians about these threats for over a decade. We see foreign governments, the likes of PRC, Russia, and Iran, attempt to undermine Canadian interests both at home and abroad.
That is one of the greatest threats to Canada. It is a threat to our security, our essential infrastructure, our means of subsistence, our prosperity, and our sovereignty. But let's be clear, we are taking every possible measure to protect Canadian institutions and Canadian interests. That is why the government took significant measures to counter the threat ever since 2015.
National Security Intelligence Advisor Jody Thomas told this committee, we are taking concrete steps to strengthen our foreign interference approach by making sure that those who engage in such activities face consequences. Since 2015, we've had our eyes wide open. We established the Critical Elections Incident Public Protocol to maintain transparency with Canadians during elections. We've stood up the Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections Task Force, or SITE, to integrate our national security agencies. We implemented the G7 Rapid Response Mechanism to coordinate closely with our allies, and our response continues to evolve. To this end, the Prime Minister recently announced a suite of additional measures to secure our institutions. This includes appointing a special rapporteur in the form of former Governor General David Johnston to put forward recommendations to strengthen our democratic institutions. Indeed, Madam Chair, our government remains vigilant in creating new tools. Budget 2023 earmarks $16 million to establish a new National Counter-Foreign Interference Coordinator and nearly $50 million to the RCMP to increase its investigative capacity into these threats and to support those Canadians who may be targeted by foreign interference. Further, in March, I launched consultations with Canadians on the creation of a Foreign Influence Transparency Registry to ensure transparency and accountability, to put in place guardrails against individuals who may be acting on behalf of a foreign government.
This is in addition to continuing efforts to engage with the private sectors, universities and researchers, as well as with critical infrastructure, to keep them informed and up to date on the best ways of protecting themselves by giving the public access to threat alert mechanisms through CSIS and RCMP websites, as well as telephone lines dedicated to national security threats.
We continue to take a whole-of-government approach to protecting our democratic institutions from foreign interference. We must work together as parliamentarians and with all levels of government to confront this threat. In the complex and ever-evolving international landscape, we have our eyes wide open on the types of threats that could materialize. I want to reassure Canadians, as I've outlined today, we have a robust system in place to deal with the challenges we are facing both today and tomorrow. Our intelligence and law enforcement agencies will work with all partners to improve Canada's overall readiness and capacity to plan for, respond to, and mitigate foreign threats. The two intelligence committees this government has created in the form of NCCOP and NCIRA, two bodies that you have already heard on, raise the bar of transparency, Madam Chair, when it comes to how we explain we do this work to Canadians. Nous devons nous assurer.
We need to ensure that we have the best advice available and the best evidence available to take the best decisions for Canadians. And Canadians can expect that we will take the same position when it comes to protecting our democracy, our rights, and the values we hold so dear.
Though the previous Conservative government stood back and watched as foreign actors threatened our public institutions and ignored public threat reporting, our government continues to take decisive action to protect our electoral process, safeguard our institutions, and crack down on foreign actors. We will continue to defend Canada and our democratic institutions because that's what Canadians expect and deserve. And Madam Chair, I am now happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Minister Mendicino. Minister Mendicino, I do want to just note that we were supposed to have you on Tuesday and your schedule changed, and there's been a lot going on in the country. I know that your schedule did not permit you to come today, and I really did encourage you heavily, so I apologize that you are run off your feet. You did prove that your schedule was too tight, and I was a little short at the beginning, so I do appreciate you being here and your comments being exactly 5 minutes. It's the best gift of all. We
Happy
will
to be
now
here.
go into 6-minute rounds, starting with Mr. Cooper, followed by Mrs. Sahota, Madame Goudreau, et puis Madame Blaney. Comments through the chair, unless we can take turns speaking one after another. I would like us to maximize our time together, and I know we can do it. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here. Through you, Madam Chair, to the Minister, it is well established that the Beijing regime interfered in the 2019 and 2021 federal elections. We also know that the Beijing regime has operated at least 8 illegal police stations on Canadian soil to intimidate Chinese-Canadian citizens, including through coerced repatriations. So, Minister, in the face of this blatant attack on our democracy, on our sovereignty, and the safety and security of Canadians, why is it that under your government's watch not a single Beijing diplomat has been expelled from Canada?
First, Madam Chair, as you heard me explain during my remarks, this government has been concrete and proactive in combating foreign interference. We've put in place new authorities for our national security agencies, including CSIS. The RCMP have taken decisive action to shut down the so-called police stations that Mr. Cooper referred to, and we will continue to raise the bar. We're looking forward to receiving recommendations from David Johnston, and we will be full court press in fighting against this threat to our national security.
Minister, I asked you a very specific question. When the Minister of Foreign Affairs last appeared before this committee a month ago on the question that was put to her about expelling Beijing diplomats, she replied, quote, "Everything that is linked to foreign actions in Canada is under the purview of my colleague, the Minister of Public Safety," end of quote. In other words, she seeks your advice on the question of expelling Beijing diplomats. Canadians deserve to know, in the face of interference, a vast campaign of interference in 2 federal elections, police stations that are being discovered, it seems like on an almost weekly basis, why has no action been taken to expel the very diplomats involved in these activities?
Madam Chair, perhaps Mr. Cooper missed what I said in my original answer, which is that the RCMP have shut down the so-called police stations, and they will continue to be proactive in that regard.
8 illegal police stations, not a single Beijing diplomat expelled. Why not, Minister?
Through you, Madam Chair, to Mr. Cooper, we're eyes wide open about the threats. We've put in place threat reduction measure powers for CSIS. The RCMP is taking decisive action, and we will continue to be proactive.
Okay, so listen, I'm just going to pause the time for a second. I get it, and I'm also just going to be a little bit lenient because I know there's a little bit of theater involved, but like, let's just try. Your last answer was really good. It was shorter than the question was. Just try to keep it tight, and then you know, Minister Mendicino, how this works. Let's just try to go with the flow. Mr. Cooper.
Minister, what is the holding block? Is it you? Is it the Minister of Foreign Affairs? Or is it that your government is simply soft on Beijing because there have been no arrests, no charges, and no diplomats expelled? Why not?
None of the above, Madam Chair. I think I have now been very clear about the concrete actions that we've taken against the so-called police stations and putting in place additional powers to protect all of our democratic institutions.
And since, Minister, you're not going
Point of order, Madam Speaker. First, just in terms of a technical issue, I mean, and a health issue for the interpreters. But second, I feel the witness is being harassed, not allowed to answer the question. What's the point of this interaction if it's not to get a response from the minister that is here?
I don't have. I just feel like the first round's always the toughest one, and then we just have to get through it because it is just what it is. And I don't know how many more times I can say one person speaks at a time. It's difficult for interpreters. If there's advice or guidance as to what I can say or do, let me know. I welcome it. I try really hard to run a functional committee, so I appreciate the point of order. I try to preempt the point of order. So I don't know. But
so on
if
that
there's
point
advice,
of order,
yes, Mr.
On that point of order, you asked for advice. My advice would be to at least allow the minister to start answering the question before the opposition jumps in and interrupts. That would be my advice, is at least let him get a sentence out before deciding that they don't like the answer.
I think that's reasonable. Can we try to continue? And so what happens in this room, like in all rooms, there's a fine person who works really hard to turn our microphones on. So if we can all just keep our hands away from the microphone will turn on for you, and that way we know that there's only one on at a time and only one person is heard at a time. And so let's try to let the mic technician do their job and not go. And if we just keep an eye to each other, we'll see the impatience of wanting the floor back. And I think we can always provide, which is an unwritten rule, the amount of time for the question, comment, and answer, and we kind of go from there. So with that, 3 minutes left for you, Mr. Cooper. I'll go back to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have asked the minister 3 times why not a single Beijing diplomat has been expelled. So I'll ask a 4th time. Why not? What is the holdup?
Madam Chair, in fairness, Mr. Cooper also asked about police stations. I was directly responsive to the fact that the RCMP have shut them down, and we will continue to be vigilant in taking whatever actions are necessary to combat foreign interference, including, if necessary, expelling foreign officials.
And have you advised the Minister of Foreign Affairs, since she is taking your advice on that question, to expel Beijing diplomats?
Madam Chair, I work very closely with Minister Joly. I work very closely with all of my colleagues in government, and we will continue to be vigilant when it comes to combating foreign interference using all of the authorities, some of them new, which the Conservatives have opposed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Minister, no arrests, no charges. The FBI have laid arrests, but not in Canada in respect of the illegal police stations. Since you have failed to expel diplomats, and for all intents and purposes refused to answer that question, will you, at the very least, in the face of interference in not 1 but 2 federal elections and the operation of 8 illegal police stations, at least 8, at the very least, rebuke the Beijing regime?
Madam Chair, and I would strongly encourage Mr. Cooper to listen to what the words that I am saying. The RCMP have taken decisive action to shut down the so-called police stations. We've also earmarked approximately $50 million in Budget 2023 to increase their capacity to combat against foreign interference. And it's quite clear that the Conservatives are going to vote against that provision, which will actually be counter to our national security.
I asked a very specific question of the minister. The minister didn't answer my question. That's consistent with the pattern that we've seen in the last several minutes. So I will invite the minister again, right here, right now, to rebuke the Beijing regime. Will you do that, Minister?
Madam Chair, Canada is among the strongest voices when it comes to rebuking any authoritarian regime and anyone that stands
Then
against
just
human
do it
rights,
now,
and we'll
Minister.
continue to do
Then
that.
just
Point
do
of
it
order.
now.
Madam Chair, I'm
Mr.
sorry,
Turnbull?
I have to raise the point of order because clearly Mr. Cooper is not abiding by the normal rules of decorum in the committee where you don't talk over the witness while they're trying to answer the question.
I see that. I think the minister was trying to answer your comment. I know that you don't feel that way, and that's okay. I am going to give Minister Mendicino you 10 seconds, and then we'll pass on to the last 20 seconds to Mr. Cooper. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I do appreciate the concerns about how it is that we are protecting our institutions, and we will continue to, and also, again, condemning any violation of human rights. Canada has a very proud and strong record on that front.
Well, the minister couldn't even see fit to rebuke the Beijing regime for election interference and for operating 8 police stations in Canada. This is a government that is very weak on Beijing.
I couldn't disagree more.
Thank you. Mrs. Sahota.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And maybe I'll try to do the Conservatives and Mr. Cooper and the Minister a favor. After that interaction, we were able to learn a little bit about the steps that the government has taken. I know that many Canadians in the news learned about these so-called police stations. And however, it was also learned that Canada is not alone in this struggle, that over 53 countries report about 102 Chinese overseas police service centers. So just wondering if the minister wants to add anything else to the steps and the measures that were taken by the government.
Madam Chair, through you to Ms. Sahota, first, I appreciate the question. It allows me to expand on how it is that we are combating foreign interference. I talked about how we have created new authorities and powers for our national security intelligence agencies through Bill C-59 that bestows upon them the ability to both address and mitigate any potential threats to our national security. But we've also put into place a protocol that applies specifically during elections. It is called the Critical Election Incident Public Protocol. It is applied by our most senior, nonpartisan, professional public servants who have been charged with the responsibility of both receiving information and intelligence as it relates to any foreign interference which could pose a threat to an election, as well as when we inform and educate Canadians about that work. This is a protocol that has served Canadians well, but I would also point out to Ms. Sahota that we are not resting on our laurels, that we are building on the recommendations that have been put forward by 2 other distinguished Canadians, and Mr. Judd and Maurice Rosenberg. And I know that my colleague, Minister LeBlanc, has reported recently to the Prime Minister on how we are advancing recommendations to strengthen the mechanisms that we have in place to protect all of our institutions, most especially our elections.
Thank you for that, Minister. So you've, in that and in your opening statement, you've mentioned several tools that have been put in place. How, I think the difficulty that Canadians face is how the average Canadian is able to perhaps utilize these mechanisms put in place if they feel are victims of state-backed intimidation. I know that you mentioned the $16 million in the budget. I'm really interested in particular how this would protect those of diaspora communities, which we often see are intimidated by these types of tactics.
That is an excellent point. And in the context of the consultations that I am doing right now to create a foreign influence transparency regime, I've heard directly from numerous community leaders and diaspora about their concerns of being stigmatized, marginalized, being subject to intimidation, harassment, abuse, or worse. And that is why it is very important that in this work that we are connecting those Canadians with the appropriate agencies within government to provide them with that support. Because it is only by shining a light on where these threats occur, being transparent about how authorities are exercised by the various agencies, whether they be national security or conventional law enforcement, that we can maintain that trust and confidence in our institutions. And that's exactly what I have been doing, traveling across the country, connecting Canadians with the appropriate authorities so that they understand how it is that we are applying those tools and also how we can evolve the toolkit in general when it comes to combating foreign interference.
I'm glad you're going out into the communities, and I look forward to you continuing that work and then letting us know the result. How much more time do I have? 1.5 minutes. Okay, perfect. Over the last few months, Minister, we've heard a lot of accusations regarding elected officials. We've seen on social media vile accusations against senators and MPs of Asian descent that would make McCarthyism proud. How is this type of polarization of the issue counterproductive to our common objectives of protecting democracy?
It's a very important question, and you know, as much as we need to be vigilant against the threat that is posed by foreign interference, I think we also have to be vigilant against the kind of stereotyping, stigmatization, and overt racism that we have seen throughout our history. And we need to be vigilant against both because both are threats to our democracy. So even as we expand our toolkit to protect our national security, our democratic institutions, we also have to be sure that we bring Canadians along. And the experiences of Canadians does inform how it is that we are having this debate, having this discussion. And it is my commitment, the commitment of the officials that are at this table, and indeed the government, that as we create new authorities and powers and tools, that they will be exercised responsibly in accordance with the law and the Charter.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. Madame Goudreau.
Ms. Goudreau. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll ask a question that I would like to know, on something I'd like to know more about. What are the new things we've heard, a coordinator, a protocol? What are the new measures in place? Madam Chair, that is an excellent question. As I already explained, there are appropriations in the 2023 budget to create and implement the position of a national coordinator against foreign interference. This is an office, actually, a new office, and its purpose is to bring together all resources that are used so they can be applied effectively within the context of powers and authorities provided to fight foreign interference. Given that 6 months ago at this committee we expressed concern and we want to maintain confidence in the integrity of our elections, how will this office be effective and how will it work? Again, a good question, Madam Chair. The work has already begun. There are a number of people activating the office, working on that with federal funding that is earmarked in the 2023 budget for the coordinator. We hope soon to move to full implementation. For those watching, when will we have details on the action plan and when will that office be operational? As quickly as possible, but I would like to reassure colleagues, that many other measures are already underway. Can we hope, given that time marches on and this is urgent, we need to check our thresholds. We need to ensure that our legislative program is has sufficient teeth, because there are gaps and deficiencies. Can we imagine or hope that in the next 2 weeks this committee might receive the action plan with a timetable of when the office will be operational? My team and myself will always do our best to work with the committee, but the faster we implement the 2023 budget and pass the Budget Implementation Act, the faster we'll move. We're very concerned, so once that passes, we can hope this will move forward quickly. It is your responsibility, and you have had 6 months to prepare. This is a fundamental question. I would like to reassure my colleague, Madam Chair, that we will remain vigilant on working through this and implementing the office. Thank you. My last question, and I will ask my colleague if she wishes to continue. On stigmatization, you expressed a concern on or for the Canada-China Committee. What mechanism do you plan to establish to provide protection? You are the Public Safety Minister, and it is tangibly your responsibility. What do you say to people who are feeling stigmatized? In the particular context of foreign interference, we had already established a space that is both safe and inclusive for Canadians who wish to engage in the consultations. I myself had actively participated in engaging community leadership. But above and beyond the portfolio, as such, there is a strategy to combat racism. And with both those approaches, I believe we can create a constructive, inclusive, and genuinely safe space. Madam Chair, I would like to ask our witnesses whether he can, once the action plan is made public after the budget is passed, I would like the tools designed to protect our community to be part of the report. Thank you. Minister, above and beyond budget considerations, there are legislative issues at play. For example, the creation of a registry of foreign agents. That issue was brought up over 2 years ago. Why has that not been done? It's not a budget issue. That is a good question. We had initiated consultations. In the coming weeks, I will engage with you and all parliamentarians to provide an update of everything we've been hearing and understanding through our consultations with a view to creating this new mechanism. We've been talking about this for 2 years. The fact that there are foreign agents that have an influence on the Chinese diaspora is well known. We asked about this 2 years ago. Why is the register not yet established? I understand the urgency, but we need to establish a mechanism that also includes protections against stereotyping and stigmatization. When we can provide an update, we will. We will give you all the details.
Well, thank you, Chair, and I thank the witnesses for being here. It's good to see you, Minister Mendicino. So I do have a few questions. You know, I found interesting listening to your statement today, and you talked about how robust the system is, and yet a lot of the testimony that we've heard has told us that it is not robust, and that part of the challenge, of course, is legislative, and that we need stronger, firmer legislation. So that's something I'm very interested in. But I'm also interested in hearing a little bit more about the goals moving forward around the foreign agent registry. I do have concerns. I've heard from many people who are concerned about being targeted and how ethnic communities could suffer as a consequence of any false accusations. So my questions for you on the foreign agent registry is, what is the framework that you're looking at? How are you addressing key things like, what does this mean for citizens of Canada? Will citizens of Canada be put on this registry? If so, how will you deal with charter rights? If it is just non-citizens, what does that mean? So we know that Canadians have various status in Canada. So I'm curious about those different statuses and thinking of permanent residents. And then how will you decide? Will it be people from particular countries that have been identified as participating in foreign interference or targeting Canada? Like, I think Canadians want to understand what the structure will be and what those components will look like. I think Canadians need to know if they could potentially be on this registry and what that would mean for them as well.
Through you, Madam Chair, to Ms. Blaney, I completely first share the concerns that you articulated about how it is that we create this new registry. And in my own conversations and interactions, many have expressed the worries and the fears that there could be either inadvertent or advertent stigmatization as the result of it, which is why we are engaging in these consultations to use that advice to inform the creation of the tool. The last thing I'll say in response directly to your question, Ms. Blaney, is that you have identified a number of specific elements which will form the parameters of this registry. So are we looking at principals? Are we talking about citizens? Are we talking about foreign nationals? Are we talking about both? Are we talking about countries? Are we talking about a country agnostic approach? And finally, do we put more of an emphasis on the types of activities so that we can promote transparency around what is legitimate diplomatic engagement here in Canada versus the kind of activity that goes beyond that legitimate and lawful activity and that instead spills over into clandestine, deceptive activity that is counter to Canadian interests, both here and abroad. So you put your finger on some of the very crunchy questions that we've got to answer as we create this tool, but my commitment to you is that at the end of the day, it will be one that is consistent with the values of the Charter.
Well, thank you for that. I think that's got to be watched very carefully, and I hope that as you're going through the process, the consultation is inclusive enough and also informative enough to the public that people know when to respond, because it is really concerning to look at that and to know that there are many people from many countries who have been here in some cases for generations who are already feeling concerned that they may be specifically targeted. I'm also interested in knowing we know that disinformation is one of the biggest challenges, and information is flowing out that is not based on fact, and it's concerning Canadians and it's scaring them sometimes. And so I know that Australia has their Australian national security, where every day people can look up on a website what's the national threat level today. They can report any suspicious behavior that they see, and there's a day-to-day security concerns that can be updated, and people can actually look on that website to see if there's been misinformations come out into their country, into their community, and see what was done about it, and then they know, oh, that was absolutely misinformation. So I'm just wondering if there's any discussions happening around exploring that opportunity.
Madam Chair, again, through you to Ms. Blaney, I think it's an important suggestion worth studying very carefully. I would also highlight that Canada has shown some important leadership on the international stage. We created the rapid response mechanism in conjunction with our G7 allies. That's incredibly important when we're talking about international events of consequence, like, for example, Russia's illegal invasion into Ukraine. Mr. Putin has been making scandalous claims as though, for example, he is denazifying Ukraine. We need to push back aggressively against that kind of disinformation. But I would also point out, Ms. Blaney, that it strikes very close to home as well. Throughout the course of the pandemic, 90% of Canadians who did any research on vaccinations were at some point exposed to disinformation. So as we do this work, it is important that we think about it both internationally but as well here on Canadian soil. And the last thing I'll say is that in my own engagement as Minister of Public Safety and with my Deputy Minister last fall when we were in Germany for the G7, I specifically engaged our G7 counterparts on the question of disinformation, and I'm pleased to report to this committee that next week we'll be taking the next steps towards having that conversation on how we can combat this threat too.
Thank you. We're going to go into our second round, and I'm just going to note for our official record that the last 3 exchanges probably were the best in the sense of getting the maximum out because there was not people speaking over each other. So I would like for us to continue this in the second round. And for the second round, we will have Mr. Berthold, followed by Mr. Gerritsen, puis Madame Normandin, and then Ms. Blaney. And I'm hoping to squeeze in a full round, so then I will go with 2 more, if we can keep it tight. But I'm not going to name who would be next, because if I have to continue interrupting, we will not have the time for that. Mr. Berthold.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Minister, the committee understood the study after we heard that the Chinese government was interfering in our elections. The Prime Minister and his government seem to be influenced by political donations, by police stations in Montreal, by other issues. How can the government explain that no Chinese officials have been expelled? Is the interference from China already exerting undue influence on the Prime Minister and your government? Madam Chair, as I already explained several times, the RCMP has taken concrete action against these so-called police stations. We are remaining vigilant. I'm working with my honourable colleague, Minister Joly, on sanctions against foreign officials. If the Beijing regime is not exerting any influence on the current government, why have no diplomats been expelled? Madam Chair, we will use all of the tools and mechanisms available to government to combat foreign interference, even if it comes from China. If the Beijing government is exerting no influence on this government, why have no diplomats been expelled? Madam Chair, I had already explained that the threat of foreign interference is real, and that is why we have set up new powers and authorities for CSIS and the RCMP for the entire national security community. It is the Conservatives who tried to block the establishment of some of these new authorities, I would point out. If the Beijing regime is exerting no influence on the government, why is it that no diplomats have been expelled? Madam Chair, the government is always vigilant, and we are doing everything necessary to protect our democratic institutions. For example, taking tangible action against so-called police stations. We include the measures already implemented to protect our elections, the NCIRA group and COP. If the government is not being influenced by the Beijing regime, why is it that after these illegal Chinese police stations were closed, no diplomats were expelled and nobody was arrested? Madam Chair, we will always keep all options on the table in consultation with Minister Joly and my other government colleagues. We will take all measures needed. Why is it that no action was undertaken, if not because the Beijing government is exerting undue influence on this government? With respect, Madam Chair, perhaps my colleague is failing to understand my answer. We have taken many measures, many. and I offered many tangible examples of how we are combating foreign interference. How can the Beijing government take Canada seriously, and how is it going to stop exerting undue influence in Canada if, under this Prime Minister, the Canadian government cannot expel a single official? Isn't that evidence that they are already under undue influence by Beijing? I am confident that all actors understand that Canada remains vigilant because we have a strong record. I'm very proud of the work my officials and our team have accomplished. I'm very proud of our government, which has put in place more mechanisms to combat foreign interference. I put the question from a number of angles, and the minister is refusing to answer it. I note that the minister responsible for public safety, for protecting Canadians from foreign interference, has not taken the trouble to do anything tangible to expel any diplomats or taken any other tangible action here. Does CSIS's mandate require a signature from the minister? That's a good question. There are some examples in the legislation where I do work with CSIS to authorize a number of powers. So if I'm not mistaken, they need your signature. There are some provisions in the legislation where I work closely with CSIS in implementing certain authorities and powers. Has CSIS asked you to sign off a warrant regarding a member of Parliament? I work closely with all my officials. Thank you, Mr. Berthold. I have appreciated the way you asked your questions, and I gave you some extra time because you were so respectful, so kind, and I do appreciate it.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I'll just start off, Madam Chair, by saying that both Conservative members who have spoke in this committee so far have gone beyond reality and made comments to the effect of it has been found that, or it suggesting that it is a matter of fact, but indeed there's a lot that's surrounding this issue that is not matter of fact, and indeed they are only accusations. Nonetheless, the Conservatives have no problem conflating that with reality. Minister, my question for you stems off of indeed what I just referenced, and the fact that there's a lot of misinformation out there, and I know that you were responding to Ms. Blaney's questions about this as well. But the reality is that although it is extremely important that the media and that information get out there so that Canadians can be informed and hold their government accountable as they should be, the reality is quite often there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of rhetoric, and a lot which permeates into the public. And I'm wondering if you can comment on how that is counterproductive to democracy, generally speaking.
Madam Chair, through you to Mr. Garrettson, I think you have put your finger on one of the most challenging aspects of having a discussion that is thoughtful on the subject of how we protect our democratic institutions and our national security. In my view, disinformation is a deliberate device used to break the bonds of trust between citizens and the institutions that are there to serve them. It is corrosive. And the way that we can cut through that is by having as much transparency as possible in the way that we together need to do this work. So let me come back to the example that I was discussing with Ms. Blaney. There have been calls, yes, for some time for the creation of what we refer to colloquially as the Foreign Agent Registry. But before we do that, we thought it would be appropriate to directly engage with Canadians so that we could hear from them what their concerns were. One of the main concerns that we have heard consistently in our conversations is that there is a fear that as we afford new powers to government, that we circumscribe them in a way that is consistent with the principles of the Charter. We've heard about the concerns of Canadians who wish to engage on foreign interference, but are worried that they will be intimidated, that they will be harassed, that they will be subject to retaliation, that they will be threatened. And we need to reduce those barriers. I would submit to you that there is a relationship between disinformation and the lived experiences of many Canadians who want to step up and be part of this work.
Minister, who stands to gain from that disinformation that leads to questioning of our democracy? At the end of the day, who really stands to gain?
Those who stand against Canada and Canadian values. It's the hostile actors.
Another question I wanted to ask you was, in the first mandate of this government, Bill C-76 was introduced, which, by the way, the Conservatives voted against. That bill had a lot of teeth in it in order to try to combat foreign interference. I'm wondering if you can comment on some of the measures that were included in that bill that the Conservatives opposed.
Perhaps the most important new authority that was created under Bill 76 was that it made it illegal for foreign contributions to provide additional funding to third parties who may then in turn try to support certain parties and candidates and the like. And that shows, I think, our ongoing vigilance at wanting to protect the integrity of our elections. And really closing any potential loopholes which may have remained in place before that.
So if I understand that correctly, had that bill not passed, those loopholes with respect to foreign money coming into Canada would still be open?
That's exactly correct, Madam Chair.
Any thoughts as to why any political party would not be in favor of that?
I can't explain why the Conservatives would have voted against that provision, but I will say that it is consistent with their pattern of voting against the creation not only of new authorities, which are afforded to our national security and law enforcement partners, but equally with the other new mechanisms that have raised the bar of transparency, like NCICOP and NCIRA. They voted against those as well.
Thank you. Madame Normandin?
Ms. Normanda? Thank you. Minister, a little earlier this week, the campaign director for the Conservatives said that the party was really a one-way issue. Information was going to intelligence services but not coming back, and that there were gaps in the legislation preventing the parties to take a tangible action to stop interference. Do you agree that there are gaps in the legislation that are making it difficult to take tangible action? Madam Chair, I believe that we need to study very carefully comments made by leaders of political parties that provided testimony before the past elections. My colleague, Mr. Leblanc, drafted a report that was submitted to the Prime Minister in cooperation with the clerk that builds on all the measures that we are implementing. For example, the protocol, the Critical Elections Incident Public Protocol, and I think that is crucial. That is the mechanism that makes it possible to share information about threats during an election. The identification of legislative issues was made a year and a half ago by Mr. Delory. I find it difficult to believe you wouldn't have been informed. That's when the alarm was sounded. There may be only 18 months left until the next election, so why have those gaps not been closed so that they're tangible means of doing away with interference instead of simply providing information? I share the concerns of my honourable colleague. I would like to add that in Mr. Leblanc's report to the Prime Minister, there's a proposal there to revisit the powers and authorities in the enabling CSIS legislation and this is an opportunity to work with you and all opposition members. It is urgent, yes, but there are tangible recommendations that we can now use. If I have time, Madam Chair, we heard that one recommendation was creating an independent investigation office that would investigate foreign interference in this country. Could you envisage creating such an office that would be separate from the RCMP and CSIS? That is an important question, Madam Chair. And this has a link to the establishment of a National Coordinator's Office. There are other recommendations we're putting in place. Thank you. Ms. Blaney?
Well, thank you, Chair. So I just have a couple of last questions. I know that correct me if I'm wrong, but the consultation process that's happening with the Foreign Agent Registry ends around the 9th of May. So if that's the case, I'm just wondering if you could give the committee a bit of an outline of what the next steps will be and what the timeline is.
Madam Chair, through you to Ms. Blaney, on May 9th, we will close the current formal consultation, and then the next steps will include publishing a What We Heard report to capture the conversations that I've had, my officials have had. I also would point out that there is a website where we are receiving submissions, so collating the main themes of feedback will be published in that report. And then thereafter, Madam Chair, what I would say to Ms. Blaney is that we hope to come in fairly short order with a proposal around the creation of this tool.
Thank you. My next question is, I'm an MP that represents a more rural and remote region of Canada, and accessibility of information can sometimes be a bit of a challenge. And when it comes to misinformation, one of the things that does concern me greatly is a lot of our local newspapers are really struggling to continue to find ways to fund themselves because the world is changing, and yet they are a trusted resource for folks. So I'm just wondering, in terms of addressing misinformation, what are the strategies around really meaningfully doing that in communities that may be losing? And my region has not lost their local paper, but other regions have. And there's a standard of information there that is not necessarily the case online. And there's also communities that are not having internet accessibility. And so that is a challenge. And also just for different age ranges, like some of folks that are elderly may not be able to get on a computer because that's not something they're interested in. I know my grandmother was absolutely convinced that she would never learn how to use a computer. So when we lose those trusted resources of newspapers and local small communities, how do we assure people that they have access to information that is actually legitimate and safe for them to understand and believe?
Madam Chair, I would offer to Ms. Blaney the opportunity to have her grandmother perhaps speak to my mother-in-law, who was initially resistant but is now very proficient. So happy to do that. But if I may just be permitted perhaps one brief minute, and I'm happy to stretch my time, Madam Chair, to accommodate. But there's two things I would say. One, it is important that we continue to educate Canadians on disinformation, and for rural, that means continuing access to broadband. We hear you on that. But I think more importantly, we've seen some very troubling, I think, trends around the attack of the role that media play, including the CBC and Radio Canada. That's fundamentally wrong. They are a pillar of our democracy, and I think it's important that we also recognize that our work as parliamentarians has to include all of our democratic institutions, including the role that media play.
Thank you. We will go to Mr. Calkins, followed by Mr. Turnbull. So we'll take you up on that offer. Mr. Mendicino, that would just bring us to a full hour of when you had joined us, and that's what we were asking of your time, so thank you. Mr. Calkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Minister, in your opening remarks, you spoke about your so-called robust measures. We've heard from numerous witnesses that have appeared before this committee talk about numerous incidents and numerous ridings where information was sent into the robust measures processes that you put in place. Have those robust measures ever triggered a public notice in any of the election, in any of the campaigns, in any of the ridings in the last two elections?
Madam Chair, I'm confident that the nonpartisan public
Madam
servants
Chair,
who exercise their discretion under this protocol have done so in a way that has protected the interests of our elections. And I would also point out that the elections in 2019 and 2021 have been
I have a
certified
short amount of
as
time,
free and fair.
Minister. It was kind of a yes or no question. I'll just take that as a no. Have your robust measures ever resulted in any diplomats being expelled? We've had actually records of diplomats from Beijing actually publicly taking credit for changing the outcomes of elections in at least 2 ridings. Have any diplomats under your so-called robust measures been expelled? Yes or no? We all know the answer. You can just say it, Minister.
Madam Chair, I've explained the many concrete actions that we have taken against threats posed by foreign interference, and will continue to be vigilant on that front.
Minister, under your so-called robust measures, have any charges been laid against anybody for foreign interference? We know that our Five Eyes allies, who used to actually involve us in the security arrangements that are now passing us by, have done so where charges have been laid in places like the United States and Australia and other places. Have your robust measures resulted in any charges being laid? Yes or no?
Madam Chair, I'm confident that the discretion that is exercised independently, operationally, by law enforcement will safeguard all of our democratic institutions and our communities.
Well, it seems to me, Minister, that your robust measures on election integrity seem to be about as robust as your measures on bail reform. So I'll get off that tack, and we'll move over to your comment on Eyes Wide Open. On the Globe and Mail reported on February 17th, based on their review of a CSIS document from December 20th, 2021, that political campaigns quietly and illegally returned the difference between the original donation and the government's refund back to the donors. So under the direction of Beijing, donations were being made to political campaigns, and then those campaigns were illegally returning the money back to those donors to make them whole after they got their tax receipt. That's collusion. Would you like to change your Eyes Wide Open comment to maybe Eyes Wide Shut under your robust measures?
Madam Chair, as I've indicated, the government has taken unprecedented steps in the creation of new authorities, including protocols that are there to protect the integrity of our elections, and we've had 2 reports that have certified that the elections in 2019 and 2021 were both free and fair. And we will continue to build on that record, receiving recommendations from Mr. Johnston, working with parliamentarians at INSICOP, using NSIRA as a way to shine a light on the way that we are doing this work together.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Minister, do you remember 2 parliaments ago, there was a bill, C-406, which would have banned foreign money coming into our electoral process. Do you remember how you voted on that bill, Mr. Minister?
Madam Chair, what I can tell you is I recall my votes on C-76, C-59. I voted in favor of them in conjunction with the government. The Conservatives voted against those 2 bills.
About you and your colleagues. As a matter of fact, that was my private member's bill banning foreign money coming into our electoral process, and you, Minister, voted against it. Your colleague, Mr. Gerritsen, did, and the entire NDP caucus did as well. So it's interesting how how we seem to want to say one-sided things and create a narrative that simply isn't true, even somebody who is supposedly a competent minister of the Crown. But I'll move on to a different question. We know that...
Oh. Pause. Yes. Mr. Gerritsen, point of order.
I know that Mr. Calkins thinks he's extremely witty with his comments, but perhaps challenging somebody's integrity and their ability in this forum is not only in contravention of our standing orders in the House, which would apply to this place, but also is extremely unprofessional and extremely rude to any witness, whoever that witness may be. So perhaps, Madam Chair, through you, Mr. Calkins, who, by the way, has been in the public calling members of Parliament's agents of Beijing, would like to, if he's not at least going to apologize for that comment, apologize for questioning the integrity of the minister who's sitting at this table right now.
I appreciate that. I will come to you, Mr. Calkins. I have been really persistent as to how I would like our committee to function. At the end of the day, when it comes to our democratic institutions, as much as people might take this lighthearted or think it's I don't even know what, this is a really serious topic. And I know my constituents are very concerned with it. And so at the end of the day, we all say one thing, and then our comments and actions demonstrate another. And I honestly don't think there's any place for that, Mr. Calkins. So I'll give you the floor, yes?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will respectfully withdraw the comment
I would hope
in
so.
the way it was taken. Most of our legislation does refer to a competent minister shall in that legislation, and but I will withdraw if the offense was taken. I certainly will do that. So, Mr. Minister, we know that security cleared Liberal staff were briefed on September 28th, 2019, that the 2019 candidate for Don Valley North was part of a foreign interference network. Jeremy Broadhurst, who was just here earlier, determined that the contents of the briefing to be so serious that he personally alerted the Prime Minister the next day. So the Prime Minister knew about Beijing's interference benefiting Liberal politicians since as early as the time of the 2019 election. We also know that the February 21st, 2020 PCO document alerted the Prime Minister that the political staff and politicians take broad guidance from Beijing's Toronto consulate, and we know that the Prime Minister and the ministers received CSIS briefings that some political candidates are witting affiliates of Beijing's interference schemes. So my question to you, Minister, is have you investigated which members of your caucus or which Liberal candidates in the past two elections may have knowingly cooperated with Beijing's election interference schemes?
Madam Chair, let me say a couple of things. First, in response to the specific question, we take foreign interference very seriously. I believe all parliamentarians do. And in the last hour, I think we've explained what our record is and what we are going to continue doing. Lastly, with regards to the comment that was made, I personally wasn't offended by it. I think it's a reality of being in politics today that we need thick skins, but I think Canadians would be offended by that remark. And it perhaps explains why it is that we need to do this work together to protect our institutions. That kind of personal attack is becoming far too often a thing, a hallmark of the way that we have these debates. I'm glad that Mr. Calkins apologized, but I came here to offer what I thought was important testimony on a very serious issue. I've tried to be responsive, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Mr. Turnbull, 5 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Minister, thanks for being here today. Do you direct the daily operations of the RCMP?
I do not.
Do you direct the daily operations of CSIS?
No.
Okay, and I know that, so essentially CSIS and RCMP have an independent mandate to investigate if they have actionable intelligence. Is that not correct?
Operational independence is extremely important. I would argue, especially for conventional law enforcement, this is one of the ways in which we divide functions. So you do not want elected officials carrying out investigations. That's why we have an independent police branch.
Thank you, Minister. And I note that that's very consistent with what the director of CSIS, who I know is here today, David Vigneault, said at our committee. We have the authority to investigate directly. We also had the Deputy Commissioner of the RCMP say the same thing on record at this committee. And to note that the Deputy Commissioner of the RCMP also said, and I quote, "We are not investigating any elements from the 2019 or the 2021 elections. We did not receive any actionable intelligence that would warrant us to initiate a criminal investigation." I find it very challenging when we have the opposition members continuing to claim things as though that the minister can't be held accountable for things that are not within your, essentially the investigations are things that could be happening by those independent agencies. So it's misleading at best. One other question I had for you, Minister, was the Jim Judd report made a recommendation about how the critical election incident public protocol was, operating over a time within the caretaker period. So at election time, it oversees those elections. And outside of the election period, it is not in effect. So essentially, at those times, I'm sure that ministerial accountability is what would, be the norm. And I just wanted to ask you, in terms of our government's robust all-of-government approach, it seems to me that outside of the election period, there's a lot of need for coordination because there's quite a few ministers and ministries that would be involved in combating foreign election interference. And I wanted to just ask you a more poignant question about that. Is that why a national coordinator position is so significant? Could you speak to that?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you to my colleague, Mr. Turnbull. It is indeed the vision of this new national coordinating role to bring together the various initiatives and agencies that work to identify threats that are created by foreign interference so that we can respond to them in a way that is agile. And you're also right, I think, to point out the distinction that we have put in place, which is a protocol stood up by the government but applied by our nonpartisan professional public servants during an election. But outside of a writ period, it's also important that we continue this work, and that is something that we have been doing with a lot of focus and a lot of energy over the last number of years. And I believe the many concrete examples show that this government is pushing out our policy and our posture to protect all of our democratic institutions in a way that is unprecedented.
Well, I agree, and I believe it is adequately described or accurately described as a robust approach. And there's a continual evolving or evolution of that desire that we can see to protect our democracy. I think what strikes me as really challenging within this whole study is that the Conservatives have continuously used unconfirmed, false, maybe false, or uncorroborated allegations. They've ignored the facts, which we've presented many times in this committee about the many measures that our government has put in place. They've accused our Prime Minister of working against the interests of Canada. They've called into question our democratic institutions, which I think can compromise the faith that Canadians have in our democratic institutions. Minister, could you comment on how this partisan rhetoric is having an impact?
Madam Chair, negatively. We've seen some of that behavior on display today, unfortunately. But the fact of the matter is that the only way that we can address the very real threats that are posed by foreign interference is to find ways to work across the partisan aisle. We do that through NCCOP. NCCOP has put forward recommendations. The government is acting on those recommendations, and I would certainly encourage my Conservative colleagues to take a page out of that book and certainly work with us to deal with what is an issue that is not partisan.
Thank you.
With that, we want to thank you, Minister Mendicino, Mr. Tupper, Mr. Vigneault, for your time and attention today. If there's anything else that comes to mind that you would like the committee to share, if there's something you wished you had shared but you didn't get the time to, please just share it with the clerk and we'll have it circulated around. With that, on behalf of PROC committee members, I would like to thank you for your time and attention today. We will suspend for, thank you, Minister. We'll suspend for 3 minutes and we'll return with our first panel for Ontario redistribution. Thank you so much. We are now returning for our second hour to the people who are joining us. I just apologize for the slight delay, but we will make sure we go through this session properly. Before we do commence, I will say we're starting Ontario redistribution, which is really exciting for all of us. And with that, we would need to pass a budget to ensure that the clerk and analyst can do what needs to be done. Any concerns with the budget being passed? Seeing none, we will make sure we get that done. Thank you. The second thing, good news, as we've been asking for extra resources to continue this work as well as foreign election interference, next Tuesday evening, we have been given an extra hour. So instead of meeting from 6:30 to 8:30, we will get to meet from 6:30 to 9:30. Mark your calendars, I know. With that, for our second panel, as I've noted, we will begin our study on the report of the Federal Electoral Boundaries Commission for Ontario 2022. And we welcome our colleagues here today. We have Michael Coteau, MP Don Valley East, by video conference, Mr. Han Dong, Don Valley North. We have Miss Melissa Lantzman, MP Thornhill. We have the Honourable John McKay, MP Scarborough-Gilwood. We have the Honourable Robert Oliphant, MP Don Valley West. And we have Mrs. Salma Zaid, Scarborough Centre. We welcome you all and thank you for being here today. With that, each of you will have 3 minutes, up to 3 minutes, for an opening statement, after which we will proceed from comments and questions from committee members. And we will start with Mr. Coteau. Welcome.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I believe that the Electoral Boundary Commission is about to make a major mistake that will have a devastating impact on certain Toronto neighbourhoods for years to come, including Flemington Park, where I was raised, reducing support for newcomers and upending stable historic communities that have existed for for 100 years plus. Last year, the Electoral Boundary Commission for Ontario released its recommendations, which included an expansion of Don Valley East, and the public had an opportunity to review and comment on those changes. On February 10th, the Commission reversed course and recommended the elimination of Don Valley East without any public input. This came as a complete shock, and my community was angry. This is not the first time Don Valley East has been negatively impacted by electoral redistribution. A decade ago, the riding was cut in half when it created Don Valley North, and now it's being divided into 3. There are communities that I represent that have been in 3 ridings pending this proposal within a decade. My submission, which each of you have, includes 4 objections. Number 1, the lack of public notice and due process, the impact on newcomers, racialized and Muslim residents, the historical significance of the villages of North York, and a complete disregard for Victoria Park Avenue as a historical political dividing line between North York and Scarborough. Of the 4 main points, because of time constraints, I'll address 2 points. The significance of the Victoria Park line was supported by 24 MPs as outlined in a co-authored letter, and was supported by members of the adjacent to this historical border. Second, the lack of due process. I must remind members that this committee that this report by the Commission was never shared or consulted upon. No one had the opportunity to weigh in on these changes, and the original proposal recommended expanding Don Valley East, not eliminating it. This is unacceptable, and we have a responsibility to do what's right as MPs and you as a committee to never allow this to happen again. I've also made 4 recommendations that I hope the committee will endorse. My brief includes reference to court decisions that directly relate to the matters at hand, and I trust that all of you on the committee will have the opportunity to review these points. I've also tabled answers to the 6 questions the committee asked to address. I've submitted a letter from the City of Toronto signed by 23 councillors and a letter from our MPP, school board trustee, local organizations, and 2 community mosques. A copy of every email my office has received on this issue, more than 500, a petition signed by 952 people, organized by a local group of concerned citizens. The group has also coordinated the placement of 1,000 lawn signs in the riding and has had 3 community consultations. I implore you to do the right thing and recommend that this matter be sent back for public input, and you address the flaw in the legislation that has gotten us to this point. I look forward to your questions, and I just want to say thank you to the City Councillor from Willowdale who's joining us here today. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Coteau. Mr. Dong.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I'm here today to express my objections to the Federal Electoral Boundary Commission for Ontario's proposal regarding Don Valley North riding. The Commission proposed to move riding's eastern boundary from Victoria Park Avenue westward to Highway 404, which would remove the neighborhood of Pleasantview and parts of Henry Farms and Hillcrest Village from Don Valley North. The proposal would instead incorporate these North York communities into Scarborough Agincourt, and it would result in the electoral district that would be 84% in Scarborough. The Commission also proposed to include the neighborhood north of Old York Mills Road between Yonge Street 401 and Downriver. In my letter to the committee, I raised 3 main concerns regarding the Commissioner's proposals, but for the purpose of this discussion, I would like to focus on 2. First, I believe the Commission failed to adequately apply its own standards with regard to how it drew boundaries respecting Scarborough versus North York. While the Commission sought to respect the historic significance of the former city of Scarborough and took efforts to accommodate this reality, I believe it failed to do the same for the former city of North York. The Commission acknowledges this in its report the importance of recognizing and considering community of identity as well as historic pattern that determines boundaries, but failed to do so in the case of North York. The Commission rightfully acknowledged Victoria Park Avenue as a very important landmark for the residents of Scarborough. However, the Commission has failed to adequately recognize that this is also a very important landmark for the residents of North York. North York was its own municipality prior to the amalgamation of City of Toronto. And for many decades, the residents east of Highway 404 and west of Victoria Park have been residents of North York, in fact, over 100 years. For Commission to, if the Commission is prepared to consider the importance of community of identity and historic pattern with regard to Scarborough, it must do the same for North York. The second major concern I would like to raise has to do with an issue that this committee has heard much about already. That is the significant changes between the first proposal and the report that was tabled in the House. I know that this committee has heard these concerns raised by other members, and I believe the fact that other members have expressed this concern highlights its significance. These changes presented in the Commission's final report vary so significantly from the original proposal that I believe that they would have warranted opportunities for community feedback and further consultation. I do believe that there is more work to be done regarding this proposal that has been tabled, and I'm hopeful that these objections will be thoughtfully considered. I welcome the opportunity to answer any questions the committee may have today. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Landsman.
Madam Chair, thanks for having me here. A different vantage point for committee, for sure. Thanks for the opportunity regarding the boundary readjustment report for Ontario. I'm here with a simple objection to the proposed name change of the riding of Thornhill. In the proposal, it says Vaughan Thornhill or anything similar. I'd object to that as well. The objection is made on behalf of not only me, but the many constituents, as well as the Ward 1 councillor from Markham, whose constituents are federally represented by the Member of Parliament for Thornhill, as well as neighbouring Member of Parliament, your colleague, Minister Ng. There is no objection to the name change from any other colleagues or the mayors in the region. Thornhill is a unique pocket of the GTA. It's unlike any other in the sense that it was established in 1794, and the people of Thornhill identify as Thornhillers, even though they are part of the city of Vaughan and the city of Markham, depending on where you live. And during the last federal boundary change, Thornhill was split into two ridings, the riding of Markham-Thornhill and Thornhill proper. The name of the Markham-Thornhill riding makes sense because 100% of that riding resides in Markham. As the same in other neighbouring ridings, you would know from your colleague, Mr. Sorbera, that his riding is Vaughan Woodbridge. 100% of his riding is in Vaughan. So it causes a bit of confusion. There's other examples where our colleague from King Vaughan has both of those municipalities in her name because it straddles both of those municipalities. Now, I realize that many colleagues around the table would have many, many municipalities, but when you only have two and you put one in the name, it creates confusion for people that live there. So the riding currently of Thornhill straddles both municipalities, Vaughan and Markham. So I'd appreciate if the committee would consider keeping the name Thornhill, and I'll cede the rest of my time to somebody who wants it.
Thank you kindly for that extra minute back. We appreciate it. Mr. McKay.
Thank you, Chair. Could I suggest that Ms. Zayed goes next because our Mr. Koto's, Madame Zayed, and my submissions are all kind of flow from each other, and she would be the logical second person to speak.
Ms. Zayed.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. I trust you all have read my detailed objection. In short, with its final report, the Federal Boundary Commission for Ontario made radical changes not envisioned by the interim report with no opportunity for meaningful public consultation. These changes split the existing constituency in half and split important communities of interest. My objections are threefold. First, procedural fairness. The final electoral boundaries map for Scarborough is a major deviation from the original proposal. That has not been justified. The new boundaries were created without effective consultation with the communities impacted by this new proposal. The second one, the new boundaries do not take into consideration important communities of interest in Scarborough Centre, including one of the largest Muslim communities in the Greater Toronto Area. More than 20,000 Muslims live in the riding, and the proposed boundary is a block from the major mosque. Drawing the proposed riding boundary at Midland Avenue effectively splits this community in half, which will create confusion about where and how they can access the government support. It also divides a major Tamil community of 10,000 people, and these new boundaries proposed would also split this community, separating them from community resources and businesses they routinely access. And as other levels of government map their boundaries to the federal boundaries, the proposed borders will also create challenges for other orders of government by splitting the catchment area for 3 schools serving the marginalized and the new immigrant communities. These schools serve members of marginalized communities. Electing a trustee not responsible for their children's school will make it more challenging for parents to effectively advocate for their children and ensure they are able to access the extra resources they need to succeed in an at-risk neighborhood. And thirdly, the new boundaries eliminate the traditional Scarborough border at Victoria Park Avenue and merge communities with very different socioeconomic profiles. To address these objections, I'm proposing a series of boundary changes that will keep communities of interest together in a number of Scarborough ridings and ensure a stronger Scarborough presence within these 6 ridings that is currently proposed. These boundary changes are proposed in consultation with the support of the members of Parliament from Scarborough-Gilwood and Scarborough-Rouge Park. A map showing the proposed borders was included with my full complaint. Finally, given that our proposed new boundaries would result in a riding that is 68% Scarborough, compared to 55% Scarborough under the borders in the FCBO's final report. I request the riding continue its traditional name of Scarborough Centre. This is the name familiar to most residents and will help avoid confusion. I ask the committee members to recommend these proposed changes to the Federal Boundary Commission for Ontario, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, just want to make sure I'm following logic. Mr.
Thank
McKay.
you, Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and may I say I adopt Mr. Coteau's and Madame Zayed's remarks in full. This is really a tale of three maps. I hope that they've been distributed to you. The first map is the current configuration of the boundary. The second map was the first suggestion of the Commission, to which we submitted no objection because it worked to the greater benefit of both 416, but more particularly to Scarborough, which recognized the integrity of Scarborough, and so we supported the objections to that. The third one, completely blindsided, totally butchered the riding, bear no relationship to anything else, did bits and pieces because of other configurations. So I'm left to be the only one to object because the community had no opportunity to object, no opportunity to weigh in, no opportunity to say what they might prefer. So this is a process objection as much as it is a substantive objection. This proposed configuration, as Madame Zayed said, bears no relationship to communities of interest, bears no relationship to geographical sensibilities, bears no relationship to historical truth, and bears no relationship to the integrity that has been Scarborough. Literally, I don't think we could go quite back to the 1700s, as Ms. Lansman said, but and there might be some who said I was there. But it is a community that has had its integrity over many years, and at one point was a township, then it became a borough, then it became a city, and now, much to its resistance or much to its chagrin, is now part of the Greater Toronto Area. So with that, may I cede whatever time I have left to either Mr. Coteau or Madame Zayed. I thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you. Yeah, the time will not go to the others, but when they have questions and comments, they shall receive some extra time. Mr. Oliphant.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, members of PROC. It's particularly good to see Mr. Cooper here today, because I know uniquely among all members of Parliament, he has the maps of all our ridings over the last 100 years and the election results firmly ingrained in his head. And he will know that these communities have bounced back and forth over a number of times in the years. You are dealing with the report from the Electoral Boundaries Commission for Ontario. I'd like to present two relatively minor objections, and I would see them as improvements. They have no domino effect on the work of the Commission, but respond to a local concern and a community of interest concern. They were not in the initial report of the Commission, being added only in the final report. The first is with respect to the name, and I believe it would be best it remained Don Valley West, not renamed Don Valley South. The second is that the small area known as Governor's Bridge should remain in University Rosedale and not be included in the new boundaries of Don Valley West. On the first issue, the final report of the Commission says that the entire new riding lies west of both branches of the Don River. The name Don Valley South is inconsistent with the real geography of the riding. In 2013, the then Electoral Boundaries Commission rejected a proposal to change the name of Don Valley East to Don Valley South. The Commission concluded that, quoting, while the electoral district is situated south of the electoral district of Don Valley North, it is also situated east of the electoral district of Don Valley West. I'm getting all your Don Valleys here. The current riding of Don Valley West is situated to the west of the current riding of Don Valley East, and the proposed riding will still be situated to the west of the amalgamated riding of Scarborough Centre, Don Valley East. Further to geography, this is a little bit about the rivers. The source of both branches of the Don River is indeed north of the current proposed riding of Don Valley West. However, the Don continues south and touches on 4 other ridings until it reaches Lake Ontario. Additionally, the name is well known, and as my written submission indicates, 94.5% of the new riding has already been at one time or another called Don Valley West, either before or after the last redistribution. Changing it would add confusion to the residents. In summary, the proposed riding name change to Don Valley South would be inconsistent with the conclusion of the 2013 Commission, would be geographically incorrect because the Don Valley South is much further south, and would cause confusion. My second objection is with respect to a very small part of the newly proposed riding called Governor's Bridge. Simply put, this area does not share a community of interest with surrounding neighborhoods in Don Valley West. It really is part of Rosedale. I don't think it has ever been persuaded that it should be, has a community of interest with Don Valley West, and it is only 0.5% of the new riding, therefore has no material impact on proportionality or numbers in the riding.
Thank
My
you.
2 suggestions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Brilliant. We will now proceed with 6-minute rounds of questions, starting with Ms. Gladue, followed by Mr. Turnbull, puis Madame Gaudreau, and then Mrs. Blaney. Madame Gladue.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you to all of our witnesses today. Before we go ahead, I should let you know that as the lead for the Ontario redistribution on the part of the Conservatives, I did attend nearly all of the public hearings. There were about more than 40 of them, and there was 20 or 30 witnesses at each one, and so it was quite a long undertaking. But what I would say, specific to Scarborough, is that, out of the, 800 to 1,000 people we heard from, there was a disproportionate number of witnesses that we heard from Scarborough, many constituents and councillors. So, it's my view that the maps overall, even in Ontario, that the commissioners did listen to those that participated in the public hearings and did address most of the issues. Now, I know that in Toronto specifically, one of the points that Peter Lowen, one of the commissioners, made was that the growth in Toronto was 6% versus 13% in the rest of the province, and that was one of the things that caused, the difficulty of them having to change boundaries. So specific to the witnesses, each of you that have asked for a name change, there was a lot of latitude given to name the ridings appropriately. So I don't personally have any objections to that, but I just want to make sure, Mr. Oliphant, there's no objection within your riding from anybody.
No, there isn't, and there's in fact widespread support both from the MPP as well as the city councillor, as well as the residents associations.
Okay, and Ms. Sahi?
I didn't get to that part. I got cut off. But,
Yes, people would like to see that as Scarborough Centre. Many community organizations, community leaders have written letters to the Commission in response to the name change and this new proposed boundaries.
Okay, very good. And I think, Ms. Lansman, you mentioned that everyone was on board in your area. So, Mr. Coteau, I have one question. Do you know who's organizing the group Save Don Valley East?
Yeah, that's made up of about 40 different community members. They have public meetings. They've had 3 public meetings. And they meet every Sunday. There's about 40 members, and in addition to that, they've held a public consultation. In regards to the name changes that you just asked, I disagree with both of those changes. And 45% of Don Valley East is going into Scarborough Centre, Don Valley East, and Mr. Oliphant's riding is taking a big chunk of Don Valley East. No one's being consulted on that issue, so I would say the people of Don Valley East, in general, would disagree with the name changes.
Okay, and do you know who is leading that charge on the Save Don Valley East? Do you have a name of somebody there?
We have a gentleman right here who's joining us, Mr. Aleem, and there's several other people who are part of a committee. They're made up of conservative, liberals. It's a very mixed community group.
Very good. I just have a couple of concerns about that group because their webpage is asking for donations, and I'm not sure whether or not that is allowed from Elections Canada in terms of a redistribution. So that would be a question. And the other thing is that they're collecting names, addresses, and phone numbers for everyone that signs up. And from a privacy point of view, I'm not sure.
It's a separate community-based group. You'd have to speak directly to that group. They're independent of me and my office. They've done everything themselves, and it's based on volunteers.
Right, and then I wanted to talk to Mr. McKay. In terms of all the changes, you mentioned that your changes are sort of integrated with Ms. Zahid's and Mr. Oliphant's and that whole area. Since none of these really violate the quota, have you heard from anybody that would object to the redistribution that you three are suggesting?
The number of people that have objected have been actually relatively minor in one sense, in part because there's been no opportunity to react. It's a ping pong effect here where Mr. Coteau's riding disappears, Madame Zayed's riding gets pushed to the west, and my riding gets further pushed to the west. It basically chops the riding in half and moves the Gilwood part of the riding over to the Rouge Valley. And so the community of interest that have been existent for 20-odd years now all disappear, and we're left with what I would describe as a butchered riding.
Thank you. And I think there was a lot of discussion about racialized communities and Muslim communities and the witnesses that came to the various public hearings. Ms. Said, you talked about the schools and the difficulty for parents. Well, could you explain that further? Because the municipalities aren't changing, so people really would have the same sort of school boards in their area. The federal just affects the voting.
Just in regards to the comments which you said in the beginning that as many of the Scarborough witnesses were heard, in the initial proposal, I just want to bring it to your attention that in the initial proposal by the Commission, these changes were not proposed. Majority of the changes for Scarborough ridings were north of 401. Those changes have been addressed. And the significant changes have been made to Scarborough Centre in the second proposal. So in regards to the schools, right now, Midland, the proposed boundary by the Commission is along Midland. And in that case, like the catchment areas for the three schools will divide because those schools are on the east side of Midland. So if the proposed changes are changed to the trustee level also, the trustees on the east of Midland will be different from the trustee on the west of Midland. So the parents will be voting for a trustee in Scarborough Centre Don Valley, but their kids will be going to a school where the trustee would be from Scarborough-Woburn.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Turnbull.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks to all the colleagues here that are here today. Appreciated your opening remarks. Mr. Coteau, I have a couple of questions for you. One of them is around the process, and I think maybe Mr. McKay has spoken to this as well, but we've heard quite a few times in this committee just how the Commission's process in all the provinces has followed, it's followed, I think, what they're mandated to do, but that there's deep concerns and probably flaws, some pretty significant flaws in that process. We had Jaime Batiste here, one of our members, who called it procedural catfishing, which I found was an interesting term that I hadn't heard before. But it seems to be this, you have an initial proposal and you have an ability to weigh in and react to that. And then when the second proposal comes out, if it's significantly different, then there's no real process for consultation left other than MPs coming before this committee. So, Mr. Coteau, to you, what would you say are the flaws in the process, and how can we address those quickly? And then I'll get Mr. McKay to comment on that as well.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the question. One of the recommendations we actually make in the submissions, then I think everyone has a copy of it, is for this committee to do a study on the current process. I think in the future this would be something we should aim to avoid. But in regards to this specific situation, Imagine going out and doing a consultation like this and talking about a completely different area and then getting a proposal that a final report that says something so different. We were asked to consult on expanding our riding, and then we found out the riding was being eliminated. We're here to uphold democracy. We're here to speak on behalf of the people of our communities. Could you imagine that, what I get is 3 minutes and my community gets absolutely no opportunity to talk about a significant shift in their electoral boundary that has existed since the 1970s? These are old communities, and they're people who love their community, and they don't live in Scarborough, but the riding that they will be part of now is going to be called Scarborough Centre, Don Valley East. It's completely different. So I hope, in the wisdom of this committee moving forward, we can look at this issue for long-term issues. But when it comes to this specific issue, all we're asking for is do what the Commission has the power to do. In the legislation, they can continue consulting. They don't have to just do one consultation. So use the power of the legislation and recommend that they go out there and talk about these new maps. It's in the legislation, and they have the ability to do that.
Thanks, sir. Thanks for the response. Mr. McKay, do you want to weigh in?
Ironically, you have what should properly be before this committee sitting here. Mr. Oliphant's suggestions are of a relatively minor nature, but you're one step ahead of yourselves. If, in fact, the difference between the first proposal and the second proposal is so substantive as to bear no relationship to the first proposal, then this is a deeply flawed process. And that's what our essential objection is to what's being proposed here. I understand the limitations of this committee, but if in fact there is to be a review, this would be a time to do it. And you may, and I don't know what authorities the committee has, but when a proposal, the second proposal of a riding is some order of a 25 or 30 or 40% change, and dramatic change, then that should presumably be tossed back to the Electoral Commission to make a public justification for what its second proposal might be. And in all three of our cases, I'm sure you would hear from the public about the current proposal.
Thank you, Mr. McKay. I appreciate those suggestions, and I think we've heard that kind of a common theme throughout, but I think you've given some additional thoughts that could kind of build on that. Mr. Coteau, back to you. What effects, so Don Valley East is being proposed by the Boundary Commission to be completely split up. How would that impact the residents' representation in the House of Commons, in your view?
So I grew up in Flemington Park. It's across from the Science Centre. It's an economically challenged neighborhood. I want you to just picture this. In the last decade, the riding has, and if this proposal goes through, it's been moved 3 times in 3 electoral districts. So 2015, the riding was cut, a healthy, great riding of Don Valley East was cut in half to create Don Valley North, and we dropped from 120,000 to 90,000, and now the proposal is to split it into 3. So this riding has been split 5 times essentially in the last decade, and communities like Flemington Park that are, are challenged, they keep moving them around without any opportunity for them to weigh in. It disrupts our entire support system. So, for example, the police division, the catchment area for the hospital, the catchment area for not-for-profit organizations that are doing work, our school districts, all of those maps, have to be changed again. So it doesn't allow for stability within the community and long-term planning. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Madame Goudreau.
Bonjour à vous. Good afternoon. Madam Chair, I find it interesting to see that Ontario is showing that once again at the outset. Well, I used to think that it was only in Quebec that we wondered about the process and criteria, interest communities, but we see this is multiplying. I'm happy to hear it, and I understand you. That said, I still have hope. Well, I've been here since 2019. When I lose hope, I'll leave politics. Can we, in the meantime, because there's a stage missing, you can't be faced with a proposal that you comment on and then what you end up with is totally different. Everything okay with the mic? Yes. So we don't get what we expect. I've heard your comments. You have letters of support. People were consulted. And I hope that the commissioners will listen to us and that everything that you have now can be sent off to PROC so that there is some extra step between step one, the surprise, and the final report. I do hear, Madam Chair, that some priorities need to be set to get ready for what's going to happen in 10 years. I'm looking at the criteria and the weighting. We keep hearing about ratios, but there have been changes made over decades, and nothing's going to change. So we need to think about communities of interest. You've said it. BC said it. Quebec has been yelling it out loud. I would like your comments. I'm taking the time to say all this because it is absolutely clear to me that we have to deal with these issues. What are your comments on what I've just said?
You go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I agree that this committee does have an opportunity to make a recommendation and to study this issue further and make changes so it doesn't happen again. But right now, the Commission does have the ability to continue its consultation. And I want to say that we're not here to fight the Commission. The Commission it's a big task, and we appreciate the work they do, not only in Ontario but across the country. It's a big job they have to do, but in the spirit of consultation and proper democracy, we're asking the Commission to use its legislative authority to continue consulting. To go out there and consult on these final maps. Let people in Don Valley East, Scarborough-Guildwood, people in Scarborough Centre, just have the one opportunity, just one official opportunity to have their say. So their voice is not just muted and just disregarded, and democracy will prevail. I'm not recommending that I haven't said make sure Don Valley East stays exactly the same. I'm saying allow people to be part of that process and let them have a say. So thank you so much.
Maybe if I can add to it, I really agree with what you have said. See, I'm today speaking on behalf of over 100,000 people of Scarborough Centre I represent here in Ottawa. I don't want that any procedure should be unfair to them. In the first proposal, where the significant changes were being made, people were provided the opportunity to go out and speak. I was at the submissions which were held in Scarborough Civic Centre, and I saw people speaking about why it is important for Scarborough to maintain Victoria Park as the defining line, why it is important to have 6 strong ridings in Scarborough. So why significant changes are being made in this proposal, where my constituents, like people in Don Valley East, people in Scarborough-Guildwood, have no opportunity to go out and speak. Just in 3 minutes, I cannot speak on behalf of everything. Thank you.
And in addition to those comments, let me talk about the law of unintended consequences, which you will not be able to address. Scarborough-Guildwood receives roughly $100 million a year in child benefits, Canada Child Benefit. If it's not number one in the country, it's close to number one in the country. a relatively impoverished community, particularly north of the of Kingston Road. The Guildwood part is more affluent. So with this proposal, you chop off the more affluent part and you add to it a less affluent part. Now, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe it's not a good idea. But I don't know that, turning the riding that is the number one in the country for the Canada Child Benefit into an even greater needy community with greater needs and less representation is really a good idea. And as my colleagues have said, no opportunity to say otherwise.
Moi, j'ai une question, Madame la Présidente.
I have a question, Madam Chair. How much time would they have to submit everything that might be received from the community to show that the process is impartial? Because we're hearing communities saying long and loud that in some cases they don't agree. How long would there be for documents to be submitted? A week or two?
Je vais vous donner du travail.
I'm sorry, I'm giving you work to do.
So basically for us, up until the eve of our drafting of our report, we would accept information. Anything that our committee receives, we then send it back to the commission in its entirety, regardless of where we stand. Once our report is being drafted, hence why I say the eve of drafting, we would not accept stuff after that. Once it's out of our hands, it's out of our hands. We do our job, take it seriously, and we kind of move on our way. And that's where I'm going to leave that. Solid. Mrs. Blaney.
Well, thank you so much to the chair and, of course, to our witnesses for being here today. So I will start with you first, Mr. Coutu. So if the City of Toronto maintains the 25 seats, the Commissioner would have to adjust, I understand, their final report and cut a riding from another part of the province, if I understand correctly. So I'm just wondering, you're proposing this, so where do you suggest the cut be in the rest of the province?
So all members of parliament in Don Valley, all members of parliament in the City of Toronto, the 24, I should say, in the caucus advocated for this. It was something that we jointly signed. In addition to that, this was, I have a letter here from all members of council at the City of Toronto advocating for this.
Chair,
yeah.
If I could, I'm just asking, I hear all the support. My office has heard about it. Yeah. So what I'm really asking is if you're proposing this, it does mean that the commission has to cut somewhere else. And I'm just curious about if you have an area that you were hoping to see a riding change to accommodate this one.
Actually, if you look at my submission that you have, I have 4 recommendations. And I can read those recommendations to you. I originally signed the letter with the 24 MPs asking for the 25 seats. My objection here today has 4 recommendations, and they're very specific. And they do not include the 25, even though I fully support the 25 as a sitting member in Toronto. City of Toronto is 20% of the GDP of this country. There's 252 cranes in operation in the city. Today, it's the fastest growing city in all of North America. To remove a seat and cause this disruption to the actual
all right, thank you.
Community
think I got your answer.
is a huge challenge for the City of Toronto.
Stop. Thank you so much for that. So if I could come to Mr. Oliphant, I'm just wondering, how would you say the Governor's Bridge neighborhood is distinct from neighborhoods in Don Valley West like Bennington Heights and Leaside?
So I'd like to say 2 things. One, Governor's Bridge is actually divided from the rest of the riding by a large valley. And sociologically, they are part of Rosedale. Economically, the look of the houses tend to go, and their traffic patterns tend to stay within the Rosedale community. Bennington Heights could be argued to be situated close enough, even though there is a large green belt between the two. Economically and sociologically, Bennington Heights has always been a bit of an outlier anyway. However, historically Bennington Heights has been in the riding. So one could argue that Bennington Heights could also go to University of Rosedale, but it's been there. So I've generally said that that one little island, which is cut off from everything, belongs most appropriately with University of Rosedale. It's about 400 people, about 250 electors. It's 0.05% of the riding. I think it just disrupts. It doesn't make a disproportional change. So I think it makes sense. Nice people. and I would argue on that too. With respect to the name, Don Valley South doesn't make any sense in the Rosedale area as well. Don Valley West barely does, but it could. And it's, you know, the reality is it's all about perspective on these things. For me, there's a reunification going on of 3/4 of the new part I used to represent when it was Don Valley West. It moved to Don Valley East. I argued against that at that time. So it's sort of like 10 years later, that's been reunited. But I respect the problem that Mr. Coteau is suggesting too. It's a problem for the commission. And they haven't resolved it appropriately. And I hope that the committee can look to the future to suggest a process change.
Thank you. And I hear the process change request very clearly. We've heard that from a lot of testimony, and I presume very strongly that the committee will be looking into that. So if I could come to Madame Zaid and Mr. McKay, I'm just a little concerned because it looks like there's no consensus between all the Scarborough MPs about the final version of the report. From what I understand, two of your colleagues from Scarborough are also Liberal and are in favor of the final report. So I'm just wondering how will you provide any guidance to the Commission to make changes when there's not really consensus between the MPs?
What I am proposing, the honourable member from Scarborough-Gilbert and the members from Scarborough-Rouge Park totally agree with it. With what I am proposing, it's not making any changes to the ridings like Scarborough North or Scarborough Agincourt. What I am proposing will make changes to Scarborough-Gilwood and Scarborough-Rouge Park. So it is really very important that this committee takes into consideration the split of the communities of interest, because literally having a boundary at Midland divides the community of interest into two, which is a home to marginalized communities, home to new immigrants, like a significant number of Syrian refugees and Afghan refugees have called that as their home, and dividing along Midland will create confusion for them. There are a lot of intergenerational homes on both sides of the Midland, and it will create, those communities rely more on government services, and it will be a huge challenge for those communities.
Excellent. Thank you. I understand that there are no more comments, questions from the Conservatives. Madame Gaudreau, I know, Mrs. Blaney, you just completed, so maybe something will come to mind. I'll reserve you the right of refusal. But I know that there was a quick question by Mrs. Romanato, followed by Mr. Fergus. Mrs. Romanato?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank all of the members for coming today. MP Coteau, I just want to say that I have been hearing from folks in your riding, and I want to thank you for coming today and being their voice, because they've been telling us that they didn't have an opportunity, obviously, to voice their opinion. So thank you for that. And I have a quick question for MP Oliphant. You mentioned to us that you would suggest that a portion of the riding go back to Rosedale, University of Rosedale. Have you had a conversation with the current MP there? And just because you didn't mention whether or not she was in agreement.
She is in agreement.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And that was the only question I had. Thank you.
Mr. Fergus?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to Mr. Coteau. You know, those of us from outside of Ontario, outside of Toronto, might not understand the nuances of Scarborough versus North York, but I was wondering if you could... shocking. But can you explain why this is so important for people on both sides of Victoria Park?
You know, the one thing that everyone agreed to who are adjacent to that line and all MPs that signed the document, I think it was signed by 24 MPs, is that that line should be respected. It is a traditional line. Our police divisions, our schools, our community-based organizations, everything is a line based on those traditional lines. This line's been around for 100+ years as a border separating Scarborough and North York. If you come into my community, the architecture is different. The planning was different. The schools look different. Everything is different between those two communities. And I think the one thing the committee can take away from this entire process is that everyone agrees that the Victoria Park line should be maintained. It is something that everyone that I'm aware of who's here today, including MP Han Dong and others, agree that it should be maintained. There are big differences between the two communities, and if you walked into North York, if you walked into Scarborough and you asked people, what do you think about breaking down that border and building new ridings like Scarborough Centre, Don Valley East, they would be fundamentally against it on both sides. I would say over 90%, without a question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm going to go to Mr. Gerritsen next, but I know, Mr. Dong, you're not actually allowed to ask yourself a question, but yes, you want to comment. Go ahead, quickly.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just want to add my support to what Mr. Koto, MP Koto, was saying. There is something called community council. And I know that after amalgamation, everyone look at Toronto and say, well, there is no boundary. But in fact, when the local council is having discussions, they belong to a certain community council. In North York, there is a community council consistent with their city council, and that's how they decide how to allocate resource and to support services in different neighborhoods. So if we don't respect the traditional boundary of Victoria Park, that will cause great challenges to City of Toronto in terms of community councils makeup. So I just want to add that point for consideration.
Thank you for that. Mr. Gerritsen?
So perhaps Mr. Koto is the best to weigh in on this, but I'm happy to hear from anybody. Just going back to the process and how that it's fresh in your minds, how this process could be improved. For those that were at or participated in the Zoom conference call that Elections Canada or the Commission had at the beginning of this process back in the summer, what they basically said was a change, the vast majority of the changes would take place after public consultation of the proposal. Once the final solution was recommended, they actually gave statistics on what the likelihood of changes would be based on previous years or previous exercises. And the statistics of those changes happening at this point were very, very low. And of course, they will say that that is all because of the public consultation happening between the proposal and the final. The issue is that it's almost better that the Commission makes widespread changes in their proposal to a riding during the proposal time as opposed to at this point, because then you have the luxury of all of that public consultation that a community can drive into the process. If those sweeping changes take place, as has happened to Mr. Koto's riding, after and at the final stage, you don't have any of that public consultation to take place. So I guess if anything comes to mind, Mr. Koto or any others, if you were to change the process that allows this to happen, what would you recommend? Would you say, something to the effect of only a certain percentage can happen at this stage in the game, or what would help to inform this committee to make the proposal
not to
better?
do this, but we hear the beep, 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 and then I'm going to speak. We didn't even hear the beep, beep, beep. So I think that was great conversation. I know it was a question, and I'm going to ask members to actually think and ponder how we can always improve legislation and the Act. And please send that back to us, because as Mrs. Blaney has also suggested, we should really look at what we would be recommending back to improve it, and it has been a continuous theme. So with that, I want to thank you all for your time here at PROC today and your submissions.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
In a second, yes. And I want to, on behalf of PROC committee members, thank you. If you have anything else that you would like to add, please send it to the clerk. the clerk will share it around. You are the first of 4 panels for Ontario, so you will have ample time before we're looking at a report, should you want to provide us anything for us to consider. I'm going to let our guests go unless you need them here. Excellent. So you can have a great day. And now we have a point of order from Mr. Nader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very.
Can we continue? If we can just contain the excitement for a couple more minutes, Mr. Nader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very briefly, I've circulated this to most parties, and I'm hoping there might be agreement with unanimous consent to make a small change to the Alberta report. Obviously, it's confidential, so I can't speak to it, but we have identified what appears to be an error in it. So I'm just wondering if there'd be unanimous consent to make that change to the draft report.
Mrs. Romanado?
Just, procedurally, you can't move a motion for UC on a point of order, but.
You see, when you're seeking unanimous consent, you can do anything on unanimous consent.
Mr. Gerritsen?
Could we revisit this at the next meeting? Full disclosure, I'm not exactly aware of what Mr. Nader is talking about, so if we could just revisit it, or perhaps at the next meeting go in camera for 5 minutes to deal with it.
Mrs. Blaney?
I'm just going to say that I'm happy to support it.
Sorry, Mrs. Blaney, can you say that again?
I'm happy to grant unanimous consent.
Okay.
But it sounds like not all of us are. But I just wanted
Mr.
to-
Cooper?
It really, without speaking to the specifics, it was simply an error based on an objection. The drafters misinterpreted one thing. We missed it when we went clause by clause or page by page. I missed it, and so it's just to correct that.
So I'm not feeling unanimous consent unless Mr. Gerritsen?
I've just been given what it is, and I'm happy to concede with my colleagues on this, depending on what their position is on it.
Mr. Fergus?
To tell you the truth, I would actually appreciate the opportunity to have 5 minutes at the front end of our next meeting so that we could just deal with this right then and there. In camera, please. In camera, please.
So I'm going to say there's no consent, and we will deal with this at the next meeting. Good news. We are going to do panel 2 of Ontario redistribution next meeting, followed by looking at a draft report of another province. And in the evening, as I mentioned, we will have 3 hours for foreign election interference, and we will be back in this room 225. With that, I look forward to seeing you on Tuesday. See you next Tuesday.